7th century Arabia, and felt that he had been touched by God, and not sort of judge in this sort of lofty way.
It's almost as though you're talking now, your scholarship has a quality of the compassion that you mentioned before. I also am struck by the way you talk about research and writing. It sounds like prayer.
Yes, it is, and my Jewish colleagues tell me that this is a very Jewish form of spirituality. It's what Jews do when they study Torah and Talmud. And what monks have done for years, they spend a part of the time each day in what they call divine study, where they will get milliseconds of what St. Benedict called oratio, or prayer.
So had you known this in the convent, it might have had a different ending. You mention this notion of Mohammed in his context, in his time. And one of the points that you make in your book, The History of God, is the idea that the idea of God has evolved over time. Could you address that a bit? I think that's something that people perhaps would shy away from.
Well, there is a transcendence that the word of our notion of God is only symbolic. It is a human symbol that is meant to jump beyond itself, like any symbol, into the unknown and the wondrous that can't be contained. Brahman, not nirvana, cannot be described or defined by human beings because it lies beyond the reach of our minds. But we experience this nonetheless. We seek out transcendent experiences in our lives. God is a similar symbol. And up until the modern period, people understood that it was very difficult to speak about God, that ordinary language couldn't measure up to this transcendent reality. But in the scientific period, what happened was that we started to think scientifically and rationally. Theologians put Newton's God right in the center of faith, which would have horrified people like St. Thomas Aquinas. And God became hard fact rather than something pointing to the immensity, what theologians call the God beyond God. So people like Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, said that, most modern theological orthodoxy in the Christian world today in the West is idolatrous, because it's taking a human image and making it an absolute. And that instead of seeing it simply as a springboard to something else. So theology, as it's been well said by a modern theologian, theology, it shouldn't be something that makes statements about God or defines God. Theology is, said this theologian, speech that segues into silence, that moment of awe, wonder, similar to the wonder that Einstein felt when he contemplated the indeterminate universe of quantum mechanics, and said that to live in the presence of what we cannot know, but which we can glimpse, is a source of profound joy.
So would you say your notion or your idea of the idea of God is the opposite of fundamentalist notions?
Oh, I would say so, yes. Fundamentalism has erupted in every single major world faith as a response to the particular peculiar circumstances of the 20th and 21st century. It's another religious development, a modern development. And in the Christian world, it's different, say, in the Jewish or Muslim world, but in the Christian world, it's been very much influenced by this rational, logical type of theology that sees God as fact. And fundamentalists are, like many non-fundamentalist Western Christians, are reading their scriptures with a literalism that is without parallel in religious history.
That's interesting. So you see it as very much a modern and contemporary phenomenon.
Yes.
And a dangerous one.
Well, it can be dangerous. Not all fundamentalists are violent. We often use that word in far too loose a way. Very tiny proportion of fundamentalists in all faiths take part in acts of terror and violence. Most are simply trying to live what they regard as a good religious life in a world that seems increasingly inimical and hostile to their faith. And so in their anxiety to protect the tradition and their extreme fear that it's going to be overridden by the forces of liberalism or secularism, fundamentalists often distort the tradition that they are trying to protect.
In 1984, you went to Jerusalem, and you made a television documentary for British television. And at the time, you said, or afterward you said, that this was a breakthrough experience for you, and it gave rise to, well, you wrote the Spiral Staircase, which is one of your most famous books, and Jerusalem, One City, Three Faiths, both deal with that. Could you tell a little bit about what that experience in Jerusalem meant?
Well, many things, but for the first time I was confronted with the reality, living reality of Judaism and Islam. I mean, in my rather parochial Catholic world, I had always seen Judaism simply as a kind of prelude to Christianity, and I'd never given Islam a thought. But you can't escape that in Jerusalem, because there are these three faiths jostling uneasily side by side, but you are also become aware of the profound interconnection between the three. And from that point, I started looking at the three faiths in tandem. What was important to me was that I learned so much from Judaism and Islam that helped me to assess my own tradition in a more balanced way. There were things in these other faiths that gave me new insight into the possibility of religion. In Judaism, it was the endless questioning that no one has the last word on God. You always go on, and nobody can tell another Jew what to think about God. Now, this was music to my ears after my Catholic, rather dogmatic upbringing. And what I loved about Islam was the pluralism of the Quran and the pluralism of the Sufis, the mystical element of Islam, which was the sort of dominant Islamic mood until about the 19th century, which sees every rightly guided religion that expresses itself in justice and compassion as coming from God. So it's quite common for a Sufi in ecstasy to cry aloud that he is neither a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, and that he is at home equally in a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, or a church. Because once you've glimpsed the immensity and transcendence of God, these man-made distinctions really don't matter anymore. And the problems that Muslims have with the West, they're not religious at all. I recently been at an interfaith conference in Egypt, in the Al-Azhar, one of the most prestigious madrasas in the world, and they couldn't have cared less about our religious beliefs. They wouldn't have minded if we'd all become Hottentots or something. What has distressed them has been the politics, political action in the region, and that was what they were talking about.
Well, it is interesting, though, that from that experience in Jerusalem, you not only, it sounds like, found some sort of spiritual deepening of some sort for yourself, but you sort of found your vocation as well, which
yes.
was translating or explaining or bringing together these three major world religions, and that has been what you've done since.
It has, and at first I confined myself to the three monotheisms. I studied Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in what I call triple vision, that is, you saw them all three in tandem. But more recently I've also looked at the Oriental traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism. And despite their extremely interesting, important, and significant differences, there is such a profound similarity in both their notion of the ultimate and in their emphasis on compassion. And I honestly cannot see any one of all these major traditions as superior to any of the others. Each has its own particular genius, its own particular insight, and each its flaws and failings.
Well, that is an area where you have been faulted in the sense that by being so open and so finding so much that's similar among these various religions, that I've read somewhere that people have said that you've taken the God out of religion, that it's so subjective, it's so amorphous, that it no longer is religion.
Well,
What do you say to those critics?
Well, I think I've just been with the Dalai Lama this last weekend.
Oh, really?
And he really...
He agreed with you.
Yes, and that's good enough for me.
I would
So basically, that certainly by taking this, what modern people call God out of religion, that's what we think of as religion now. But as I try to show in my most recent book, that really our idea of God, despite our extreme brilliance technologically and scientifically, our ideas of religion are really rather primitive and undeveloped. We often learn in the West about Santa Claus at the same time as we learn about God when we're very little. But our ideas of Santa Claus develop and change. People often get stuck with this sort of God that you're given as a child to start you off.
Well, I want to end here because we're almost out of time. You say that the golden rule is at the core of all religions. This is do unto others as you would want others to do unto you. That is, I guess, another version of this idea of compassion.
It is compassion. That's what compassion isn't feeling sorry for people. It's putting yourself in the position of the other.
I think we should end on that note. I want to thank you so much, Karen Armstrong. You've been such an enlightening guest.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview.